Hello, this is Dr. Llewellyn Eisen, and we are going to discuss the topic of race and ethnicity for this section of our class. My dog and cat are playing in the background, so there may be some extra noise. So, our unit objectives for this lesson, from those for the entire Unit 2, are to demonstrate knowledge and understanding of what distinguished the Christian cult from other religious cults. And number 4 of those objectives, to demonstrate thoughtful reflection and implications of early Christianity's conflation of race and religious difference. And I do know how to count, but those were taken directly from point 1 and point 4 of the unit objectives. So an outline, the outline of this lecture looks like this. We're going to talk about some definitions from modern terms, but also how the terms were understood in antiquity. And we're going to address briefly some of the 5 theories of race and ethnicity in the classical world and late antiquity, and that has to do with the concept of foreignness or physiognomy, genealogies and origins, environment, something called code switching, genetics, lineage, and, believe it or not, eugenics. And the final component for our lecture today, it will be addressing briefly race in the ancient world. So, modern definitions of race have to be careful not to be too narrow, because if a definition of race is too narrow, it will fail to recognize racism for what it is, which is, sometimes indistinguishable. If it's too broad, then every form of discrimination becomes racism, which we know is not the case at all. So there are a lot of different definitions of this term, and I'm drawing from Falguni Sheth's Towards a Political Philosophy of Race and Racecraft by Field. They define race as moving and visible signifiers for human difference, which can manifest differently in different times and in different places. Additionally, these authors argue that race is a technology for classifying difference from a defined norm that is enforced through violence or threat of violence. Additionally, these authors argue race is essentially the institutionalization of prejudice, a term that we're also here going to define. So, racism is, according to these authors, any idea that suggests that one racial group is inferior or superior to another in any way, and is based on ungrounded theories, which some authors would call prejudices, that argues that inferiorities or superiorities explain racial inequalities. This, of course, is then manifested in laws, in policies, and in actions. And there are different types of racisms. So just to go a little further with this, one who is a segregationist would argue that there are inferior and superior racial groups that can never be developed or that can be exploited. So, for example, restricting people to certain areas of residence or separate institutions like schools or churches, or keeping people, or creating separate facilities like parks or healthcare places or playgrounds, pools, restaurants, restrooms, all of those kinds of things based on race. That is segregationist, a segregationist type of racism. And then there's the assimilationist, and an assimilationist argues that a racial group is culturally or behaviorally inferior, but can improve through assimilation to a group that is superior. And this is often called the racism of good intentions. So when things like language or speech or clothing or hair are criticized as being inferior, this is assimilationist racism. So when Black women are compelled to wear their hair in a certain way, that is a form of assimilationist racism or racism of good intentions. Moving on, other definitions that we should think about is ethnicity. Ethnicity is related to race, but it is distinct from race in that it is deeper. Ethnicity is usually your family link, it is your place of origin, it is your language, or it is your culture. And very often, ethnicity is self-ascribing, while race is not self-ascribing. And I'm going to use myself as an example of, say, the distinctions between, say, race, ethnicity, and nationality. So, for example, my race is white. That is a clear identifier. My ethnicity, so my family, my DNA, my place of origin, is Welsh. My nationality, which is distinct from race and ethnicity, is American. Now, the last term that we need to define, well, actually, that's not true. We've got two more to go, but I hope this is interesting, is prejudice. Now, a modern understanding of the term prejudice is prejudices are generalizations that exist prior to the situation in which it is invoked. Prejudices are directed towards people, groups, or social institutions, which is accepted and defended as the guide to action in spite of its discrepancies with the objective facts. Okay, so prejudice is information or false facts or misunderstanding or lies that you have prior to a situation in which those ideas, thoughts are invoked. Okay. And so the difference between prejudice and discrimination is that everyone has prejudices. Everyone has prejudices inside them, okay? But if prejudices lead to changing how you act, then that can, or if prejudices dictate how you act, that can lead to discrimination. Discrimination is prejudicial treatment. And some examples of everyday prejudicial acts or discrimination would be maybe you go to the gym and you want to hire a personal trainer and you see that your personal trainer is a woman with curves. And so you make the decision not to hire a personal trainer because you had prior knowledge or prior understanding or belief that a woman who is of fuller figure or more traditionally built couldn't possibly be a woman who has strength or a woman who is in shape, because your idea of in shape might look different. Acts of discrimination can also impact how we spend our money. So, for example, if you took your car to an auto body repair shop and discovered that the head mechanic was a woman, if that surprised you, then that is a prejudice or a bias, right? So in the back of your mind, you have a vision of what a mechanic looks like. If you decide that you're not going to take your car there, that you're going to leave, that is discrimination. Another example of discrimination would be if you were at a gym and you saw this young man who was taking part in gymnastic activities, and he's the only one left in the gym, just you and him, and you decided you wanted to leave early because you're concerned that he might harm you. That is a decision that you make based on a prejudice, the belief that because he is a man of color that he might harm you, and that would be an act of discrimination. Here is Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. Some people have the belief that politics is not for women. That is a prejudice they hold, and it leads them to discriminate and vote against women because they do not believe that women are capable politicians. So believing that a woman can't be an effective politician is a prejudice. Voting against her is an act of discrimination. So these are just some distinctions in how prejudice, or some examples of how prejudice can lead to discrimination. Okay, so in the classical world and in late antiquity, racism, as we understand it today, wasn't part of how the Roman Empire operated. It was what you would call ethnocentric. And what that means is that the Romans didn't, it's not that the Romans weren't racist, it's that racism as we understand it, okay, as we define it, is not what that would not have made sense to the Romans, okay? So for the Romans, they had greater concern with other people's customs and clothing and food and religions or cults, and other people's things were dumb. They were weird and perverse, not because they were other people's, but because they weren't Roman. Okay, so that's ethnocentric rather than necessarily being racist. So what scholars define as racism, as we understand it, is really what we would call proto-racism in antiquity and in the classical world. And so we want to think about like the differences between the way people are talking about each other in a lot of these texts. And so I'm going to give you two examples. So in one text, peoples are described as slaves because they are ruled by a king. So this is an example of ethnic prejudice. So the people are not slaves because of the color of their skin or the way they look or the color of their hair or their eyes. They're slaves in this author's view because they haven't figured out how to not be ruled by this king that obviously the author thinks is a lousy king. That's an example of ethnic prejudice. On the other hand, we have in another text people described as stupid and sluggish or frail and hypersexualized because they're living in a cold or a hot climate. And so this is a greater example, or more clear example, I would say, of what we would call proto-racism. So another point that I want to sort of end with here on this definition before we take a look at the theories of race and ethnicity is that slavery in the classical world and antiquity was never racial, okay? And custom, so how people behaved, how they looked, how they wore their clothes, wore their hair, all of that eclipsed race in its importance for the Greeks and the Romans, especially for the Romans. In the Roman view, anybody of any race could succeed and rise to prominence. You know, if you were born into the right family and had access to education and all of that kind of thing. So, okay, so let's take a minute to look at the different theories of racism or proto-racism. So I've got a couple key terms for you here: code switching, environment, genealogy and origin, physiognomy, eugenics, lineage, and genetics. And these are different ways that race and ethnicity and other people were understood in the texts from the classical world and late antiquity. And so you're going to see some of this in the text that we're reading for this lesson in the letter to Diognetus. Okay, So to define some of these, physiognomy, well, let's just start with the middle. Let's start with code switching and then go up to environment and then just zip around to genetics, okay? So code switching, that's like a linguistic term that identifies people who speak more than one language or who have different names or cultures for different sets of circumstances. The assumption for code switching is that identity and ethnicity was contextual. And this should not really surprise us because we saw a little bit of this with gender as well. A really good example of this is the famous Apostle Paul, to whom we were introduced in the first week of class. And Paul has two names. He has Saul, which is his Hebrew name, and he has Paul, which is his Greek name. And it's not that he became Paul at a certain point, it's just that he used Paul. Sorry about the dog. He used Paul when it suited his purpose. We would today call code switching appropriation. But in the classical world and antiquity, it was not seen that way. Okay, what's next? Environment. So there were a lot of authors who believed that collective characteristics of groups of people are shaped by their geographic location. And so that this is the fundamental aspect of an individual, their character and the way they look. The assumption in this case is that there are essential features of these people that are not the result of either choice or genetics. An example of this would be the way groups like the Celts are written about in classical texts, that they are war mad and quickly prone to violence, and that this is a result of the location where they live, and it is a result of their climate. In terms of genealogy and origin, the argument here in the text is that collective characteristics that people have are formed by virtue of a specific location and point of origin. In other words, the soil, the very land itself, has an impact on those who live there. Now, the assumption in this is that those groups who ever live there have legitimate possession of the land and that they are uncontaminated by any, quote, foreign mix and are therefore superior to anyone from any other place. An example of this in antiquity in the classical world would be the Israelite argument that Palestine, the Hebrew argument that Palestine belongs to them, and that this fundamental aspect shapes who they are, their genealogy and origin. And we find this true with the city of Athens as well. Okay, physiognomy. Physiognomy is the practice of assigning characteristics to a person or persons, and then by extension, a race by virtue of how one person looks. The assumption here is that you can tell a person's character by the way they look. And we see this in the case of specifically people of color, and even more specifically, the descendants of Aksum, later Ethiopia, when texts write about Ethiopians as people who are more particularly prone to sin because of the darkness of their skin. There is a Christian monk named Father Moses, and he is told by another person, they say to him, "Look how sinful you are, your skin is so black, how can you be holy?" And he says, and it's very interesting the language he uses, he says, "My skin may be black, but my soul is white." So it's interesting, right, in this text that we see how physiognomy, the way he looks, is considered to be evidence of his character or his virtue. And this is going to, aspect of speaking about race is going to be particularly significant for people of color, specifically Black people, as Christian history moves forward. Eugenics, according to the classical and late antique texts, superior people should be encouraged to breed, and inferior people should be discouraged from doing so. We find this both in Plato and in Aristotle. And there's two ways of doing this, according to Plato. You can either remove the desirable offspring, or you can just engage in selective breeding. The assumption, of course, here is that you can improve society by controlling reproduction, and we know that this particular odious way of viewing human history has been used with horrible results, as we learned in the 20th century over and over again. In terms of lineage, lineage is something that contributed to the determination of a person's social identity, with the assumption that there are races that can be identified as pure and therefore superior to others. And this is very similar to the genealogy and origin theory. And we see this as it's applied to the Athenians specifically. And then finally, genetics. And genetics is the theory that physical characteristics are passed along from parents to children. And the assumption is that parents with similar characteristics will pass them along to their children as well. We see this in Hippocrates, who writes on, on hair color, on eye color, and in fact, on the shapes of individuals' heads and whether or not that's something they inherit from their parents or is forced upon them. As we know, sometimes in some communities, the shape of a head was manipulated for a newborn. So these are just some ways of thinking about these terms: race, prejudice, discrimination, racism, ethnicity, and it's a very short and surely flawed introduction to terms that we need to know. We need to know these terms because they impact how we read these texts and how we behave in this world. If you have questions for me, bring them to class, or feel free to simply send me an email and ask me your questions. And I look forward to talking with you soon. Take care.